There are medieval cities under the North Sea, entire towns just lying there on the seafloor. They were lost when the water rose in the Middle Ages. The climate changed, and the map of Europe changed with it. Ports, farms, whole communities just erased. Their ruins are down there now, silent, and that's the lesson, I think. What a lost civilization leaves behind. It's a question about us, really, our own situation with a planet that doesn't stay still. The story starts with a landscape that's gone now. To understand what happened to those towns, you have to forget the map. You have to see the North Sea not as water, but as a place, a huge inhabited plain that linked Britain to Europe. That was Doggerland, rolling hills, thick forests, slow rivers. People lived there for thousands of years after the ice left, but the ice left something behind. All that melted water had to go somewhere. It started filling the basin it had come from, a process so slow it was measured in centuries, not years. By the medieval period, that land bridge was already underwater. But the change wasn't finished. The southern edges of this new sea, the coasts of the Netherlands, Germany, eastern England, they weren't solid shores. They were more fragile. They were what was left of that drowned world. Peat bogs, salt marshes, river deltas, and that land was rich. Peat soil is fertile. Good for grazing, good for crops. For a growing medieval population, it was an opportunity. People saw a flat, empty space and saw a future. They built dikes to hold back the creeks. They drained the wet ground. They put farms and villages on soil that was spongy, saturated. They were building on a geological compromise. The land they stood on was barely above the sea. And it was sinking. In many places, it was actually sinking. Draining the peat made it dry out, made it shrink and compact, which lowered the ground even more. So you have the land slowly sinking, and you have the sea slowly rising. It was a collision waiting to happen, a countdown clock set by nature, and medieval society was living right in the middle of it without even knowing. The climate warmed for centuries. It was a quiet shift, global. We imagine a warmer world as gentle, maybe longer summers, easier winters, and for a while in Northern Europe, that's how it was. Historians call it the medieval warm period. There were vineyards in England, farmlands expanding, but the climate is a system. A change in one place sends ripples. Warmer air meant warmer oceans, and water, when it heats, expands. It takes up more space. All that extra water in the North Sea basin had to go somewhere. It began to press upward, outward, against the shores. At the same time, ice at the edges of the world, in mountain glaciers, polar fringes, it began to retreat faster. That meltwater flowed into the sea, so you had this double effect, thermal expansion and glacial melt, adding volume to the oceans, a slow, relentless process. This wasn't a flood you could see in a season. It was a creep, a few centimeters each decade. Too slow for any person to notice in a lifetime, but unstoppable across generations. It lifted the entire floor of the North Sea, millimeter by millimeter, and on those low, sinking coasts where people had built their lives, that extra height was everything. It meant the high tide line crept further inland. It meant a storm surge from a gale had a higher starting point, a greater reach. The margin for error, that land between a town and the sea, was being erased by physics. We know because the people there started writing it down. Monastic scribes in abbeys on the coast, they began to record something new. Their entries shift. From the usual hardships to events of a different scale, they write of storms of unprecedented fury, surges that didn't just flood fields, but broke through dikes that had held for generations. They describe salt water poisoning wells, waves clawing away whole sections of coastline overnight. These weren't just bad weather, they were signals. The Chronicles mark a turning point, A new era of vulnerability where the sea was no longer a predictable neighbor but an active, rising threat. The map was being tested and redrawn by a force no king or army could command. Their records are the first-hand accounts. You have these monasteries on these coasts exposed. And the scribes there, they're writing, but what they're writing starts to change. It's not just the usual hardships anymore. It's something else, something bigger. There's a text, the Annals Colbasienses, from a monastery in northern Germany. It doesn't just note a storm. It describes a great flood in 1260. A terrible tempest. It drowned people, it drowned cattle. The language is plain, but the scale of it comes through. Then over in England, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. For 1099, it records a catastrophic flood. Many villages inundated. These aren't vague, they're specific, dated, and the brevity is chilling. But these monks, they were recording more than weather. They were watching their society's foundation come apart. The entries go deeper. They talk about parish churches, the heart of a community, swallowed by the waves. They describe salt water poisoning the wells, saturating the fields, making the soil barren for a generation. The sea wasn't just taking land, it was taking a way of life. And in these lines you can feel a fear taking hold, a sense that the natural order was broken, that the sea had become vengeful. This change to the landscape, it was a psychological trauma. For people whose faith, whose whole world was tied to the land, its dissolution must have felt apocalyptic. The Chronicles keep that voice, the shock. The sorrow. To them, this wasn't some slow geologic process. It was a series of violent personal disasters. A family's farm gone in a night, a neighbor's home just vanished. The safe path to the next town, now a treacherous channel. These texts are the most direct window we have, a fragile bridge across centuries, to the moment people realized their world was changing. In ways they couldn't control, couldn't even fully understand. The story was being written then, not in history books yet, but in the wet ink of monastic registers. A desperate attempt to make sense of the senseless. Of all the towns lost to the rising sea, one name comes up more than any other: Rungholt, a place that went from history into legend. It was a trading port on the Frisian coast, a busy hub in the Wadden Sea, and the stories say it vanished in one night, a single, terrible night. That date was January 16, 1362. There was a monstrous storm, a tempest so fierce it got a name, the Grote Mandrenke, the great drowning of men. The legend says the storm surge broke the dikes and swallowed the whole town. No one survived, and over the centuries the story grew. It turned into a myth. People said Rungholt was a city of sinful pride, its people arrogant, that their downfall was a punishment from God. Fishermen told stories of hearing bells, the ghostly bells of a sunken church, ringing on stormy nights from under the waves. It became the Atlantis of the North, a perfect cautionary tale, but the truth might be more compelling than the fable, because Rungholt was real. Records from nearby towns confirm a wealthy settlement was right where the stories say. Tax ledgers mention it, trade documents name its merchants, and then, after 1362, the references just stop. That silence in the records is very loud. Modern archaeology has found the traces. Surveys of the Wadden Sea mudflats using magnetic sensors and core samples found the outlines of dwelling mounds, the remains of a dike system, pieces of pottery and tools. They show a substantial community, well organized and then suddenly gone. The evidence points to a catastrophic, single-event loss, just like the stories said. So Rungholt becomes this rare point where history and myth meet. The legend of divine punishment is just people trying to make sense of a senseless tragedy. To find a moral in a natural disaster, but the real story isn't about sin, it's about vulnerability. Rungholt was the peak of what that society could build on that fragile coast. It was their success, their engineering, their wealth, and the sea took it all in one night, as if to make a final point. That's why the legend lasts. Rungholt goes beyond its own history to become a symbol of all the lost towns, all the erased futures, a reminder that our greatest achievements are often built on foundations we don't fully control. Those bells they say ring from the deep aren't a curse, they're an echo of a world that was and a question for our own. Rungholt's story is powerful. But it wasn't alone. It was part of a wider pattern, a quieter kind of loss that reshaped the whole coast. All along the Frisian shore, there were these turpen, the artificial hills built to keep homes above the tide. Many of those small communities, places with names like Oldendorf or Ness, they were gradually abandoned. The sea just became too persistent. Their stories weren't dramatic. It was a slow, grinding retreat inland, leaving empty mounds behind in the salt marsh. And on the other side of the North Sea, in England, the waves were writing their own history. The Domesday book from 1086, it records a port called Ravenser Odd at the mouth of the Humber. It grew into a pirate haven, a place of wealth. But by the middle of the 14th century, the records just stop. Chroniclers said the sea had devoured it, church and all, nothing left above the water. Its fate was as complete as Rungholt's. Neither virtue nor vice offered any protection. Further south, in the German Bight, the settlement of Torum met a similar end. It was a node in coastal trade, slowly undermined. Its foundations washed away until it was just a memory on old charts. Each of these places was its own thread. Ravenser Odd was maritime daring. Torum was a link in commerce. A Frisian Terp village was an agricultural community, rooted in the land it was losing. Their disappearances sent ripples through the world they left. Trade routes had to shift, skirting new hazards. Regional politics changed as economic power moved inland with the refugees. And in the memory of the coast, a new folklore was born, not just of drowned cities, but of a landscape that was untrustworthy, a frontier that was always retreating. The loss was more than names on a map. It was a slow unraveling. The very ground beneath society's feet was being withdrawn. Calling it a retreat misses the point. When the water came, people fought. They started to engineer. That was the second act, not just loss but a response. In the Low Countries, where the land was lowest, the challenge was extreme. And their solution would change the landscape. They created the Dike ring, a dike ring. The idea was simple. You don't just build a wall, you build a complete circle of defenses around a piece of land. A fortress of earth. Inside that ring, you could live, you could farm, but the land inside was often below the sea. Water would seep in, rain would collect. So they had to get the water out. For centuries, this was back-breaking work, draining by hand. Then, in the 15th century, a change. The wind-driven water pump. A windmill, but not for grain, for lifting water, taking it from the drained fields, the polders, and lifting it up over the dike back to the sea. A machine to fight gravity. That changed everything. With this, they could reclaim land from the sea itself, create new ground from waves and marsh, one of the most profound acts of engineering in the medieval world. Over in England, a similar story on the Romney Marsh. This vast wetland was slowly won from the water, not with one project but with a network, a system of canals called sewers and sluice gates. These gates would let fresh water drain out at low tide, then slam shut when the tide came in. A passive system working with the rhythm of the sea. Year by year, they pushed the marsh back, turned bog into pasture. What's remarkable is how they organized it. This wasn't ordered by a distant king. It was local, communal. Your farm, your neighbor's farm, your whole village. Survival depended on the dike holding. So you had to work together. From that necessity came some of Europe's earliest democratic governance. In the Netherlands, they formed waterschappen. Water boards. Every landowner had a stake and a voice. They would meet to decide maintenance, settle disputes, plan new defenses, a practical democracy born from shared vulnerability. The struggle to hold back the water reshaped the land, and it reshaped society. It forged a culture of cooperation, of meticulous planning, of collective responsibility against a relentless force. This was human ingenuity, not a flash of genius, but the slow, stubborn, shared work of survival, drawing a line in the sand and then building a wall on top of it. The water took more than towns, it took the foundation of an economy. The first loss was the land, those low coastal plains, the drained marshes. They weren't empty. They were the breadbaskets, the most fertile soil. When the sea broke through, it didn't just flood a field, it poisoned it. Salt water soaked in. It created a barren crust that could take decades to recover. A single storm surge could ruin a community's food supply for a generation. This wasn't just local. It disrupted the whole agricultural system of the coast. Manors that produced surplus grain suddenly had nothing to sell. The local lord's income from those harvests dried up, like the wells going salt, and then the ports. Places like Rungholt, Ravenser Odd, they weren't just houses, they were vital nodes, where wool from English monasteries was loaded for Flanders, where German timber and Flemish cloth were exchanged. Where wine from France arrived, when a port vanished, that link broke. Trade routes bent inland, longer, more expensive, less secure. The cost of goods rose. The flow of wealth slowed. For kingdoms and lords who depended on taxes from this trade, it was a direct blow. Royal treasuries felt it. A lord who couldn't collect rents from drowned estates was a lord who couldn't afford soldiers. Couldn't maintain influence. This economic shock created a human tide moving the other way. People whose homes and livelihoods were gone had to go somewhere. They became refugees, moving inland with what they could carry. This sudden influx into towns and manors already struggling, it put immense pressure on resources. Food became scarcer, more expensive. Tensions flared between original residents and newcomers, over common land, over work, over shelter. Old social structures began to crack. Perhaps the most profound disruption was to the feudal order itself. The whole system was based on a contract, land for service. A serf was bound to work a specific piece of land for a specific lord. But what happened when that land was at the bottom of the sea? The physical proof of the contract, the manor and its fields, was erased. Many serfs found themselves accidentally freed. They could move, they could seek work elsewhere, often for wages in the growing towns. This environmental disaster accelerated social changes already simmering. It loosened the bonds of a rigid society. So the story of the lost cities isn't just a map changing. It's economies unraveling and rewiring, power shifting from the coast to the interior. People set adrift literally and socially, having to find a new place. The rising water didn't just drown land. It forced a painful, complicated rebirth of how society was organized. The echoes of that would shape Europe for centuries. The sea holds its secrets under silt and shifting sand. To find what's lost, you have to learn to see in the dark. Modern archaeology doesn't just use divers and shovels. It starts with sound. Ships tow instruments through the water. Side-scan sonar, multi-beam bathymetry. They send out pulses of sound. The sound travels down, hits the seafloor, and bounces back. A computer measures the time and intensity of that echo. It paints a picture. Not a photograph, a detailed topographic map of the bottom. And on those maps, a trained eye sees anomalies, a long, straight ridge cutting across the natural contours. That could be the ghost of a dike, a cluster of symmetrical mounds rising from the flat plain. Those could be the turpan, the dwelling hills of a village. The first clue is always a shape that shouldn't be there, a geometry nature doesn't make. Once a promising site is mapped, the search goes deeper, literally. Another tool is deployed, a magnetometer. It doesn't see shapes, it feels disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field. A buried hearth fired centuries ago keeps a different magnetic signature than the soil around it. A lost iron tool, a nail, a cooking pot, creates a tiny, detectable blip. This lets archaeologists pinpoint where human activity was most intense without moving a single grain of sand. Then comes the delicate work of confirmation. They use a coring device, a hollow tube driven into the seabed. When pulled up, it brings a long cylinder of sediment. A vertical timeline. Scientists split these cores open. Inside, they read a story written in mud. At one depth, a layer of dark, organic peat, full of pollen from reeds and grasses. That was the freshwater marsh, the landscape people first settled. Higher up, the sediment changes to clay containing marine shells. That's the moment the sea broke in. And within those layers, they might find the physical proof, a tiny seed from a cultivated plant, a fragment of a wooden post cut by a tool, a piece of hand-thrown pottery. Each one is a data point, a pixel in a slowly resolving image. Only after all this remote sensing is done do divers enter the water. The conditions are harsh. The North Sea is cold with poor visibility and strong currents. Excavating here is a meticulous, slow ballet. There's a famous site, the wreck of a medieval trading ship, a cog, found near where Rungholt once stood. It lies preserved in the silt, a time capsule from the very era of the drownings. By studying its construction, its cargo, even the personal items of its crew, you don't just learn about shipbuilding. You touch the daily reality of the trade network that vanished with the coast. Each technological advance, from sonar to precise underwater vacuum systems, is like peeling back a page of a waterlogged book. It brings us closer to the physical texture of that lost world. It lets us reconstruct not just its fate, but its lived experience. The real voices of this story are the things pulled from the mud. They're not gold, they're the worn, simple things from daily life, like a wooden fishing weir, a basket-like trap woven from willow. It was left in a tidal creek waiting for a catch that never came. That speaks to a life tied to the marsh, to knowing the rhythms of the water. And then there's a tool carved from a red deer antler, a smooth handle shaped by a hand over years of use. These objects tell us their world was one of making and mending, of using what the local environment gave them. In that silt, the oxygen-poor mud, even fragile things survive. A wooden bowl, its interior worn smooth from countless meals. A child's leather shoe, small and carefully stitched, lost in the mud. A simple bronze pin that once held a cloak closed against the wind. These are intimate glimpses. They collapse the distance. You can almost feel the weight of the bowl, see the small foot that fit the shoe. This was a domestic life. The quiet routines of family and home, but then there are clues of a wider world. In the channel, the Duve Balg metal detectors have pinged over coins. Frisian seaters, small silver pennies, and trade weights, carefully calibrated cubes of lead or bronze. These are the tools of commerce. They tell us this wasn't an isolated, poor frontier. It was connected. A farmer might sell surplus wool or cheese, getting those coins in return. A merchant from a drowned port would have used those weights to measure out goods. This was a functioning economy with rules and trust and reach. What emerges is a portrait of resilience, not poverty. These weren't people living on the edge of survival. They were communities with skill and order. The antler tool shows craftsmanship. The coins show participation in a network. The shoe shows care and resourcefulness. And that makes their loss more poignant. They weren't waiting to be saved by history. They were in the middle of building it day by day. So when we look at a salt-corroded key or a fragment of woolen tunic from the seabed, we're not looking at treasure. We're looking at a life interrupted, a meal uneaten, a journey not taken, a door that was never locked again. These humble objects are the most powerful evidence. They testify to the ordinary, precious world that the rising water took, not in a single legendary storm, but in a slow, inexorable creep that finally broke through the dikes and filled the homes. Leaving only these silent witnesses in the dark, the artifacts tell us what they held, but to see the world they built, you have to look at the ground. The marks left in the earth on that soft coast to build a house you started with a mound. A terp and archaeologists scanning the seabed, they find these mounds. And they're not scattered, they're in rows, ghostly alignments. They trace the lines of streets, the layout of a village. You can see where one home ended, where another began. A shared space, a community planned out. Then there are the defensive scars, long ridges, compacted earth and wood running for hundreds of meters. These are sea walls. Revetments built from timber and sod, meant to turn the tide, and you can find the repairs, the reinforcements. A long, losing battle. They weren't just building homes. They were building fortifications, and then the sacred spaces. In several places, excavation shows a pattern. Post holes in a distinct rectangle. The size and layout match small wooden chapels. And nearby, in the mud, fieldstones, set in orderly rows, a resting place, a memorial site. These spaces speak to the heart of it. They weren't just surviving. They were building a world with meaning, with faith, a place to honor those before. But at the heart of the Rungholt search, the most compelling evidence. A series of dwelling mounds. They don't just line a street, they curve around the edges of a wide, submerged basin. A natural harbor. The layout is deliberate. Homes and workshops facing inward toward the sheltered water. You can almost see the shallow draft boats, the wooden piers, the movement of goods. This was a planned port. Its blueprint, pressed into the seabed, shows a society that understood its place in a wider world, a connector. So these structural remains, they let us map a community's mind. The street plan shows social organization. The seawall shows collective effort, a shared threat. The chapel and resting place show spiritual anchors. The harbor layout shows economic ambition. Together, they change a collection of lost objects into a portrait of a living town. We see not just where they lived, but how they chose to live together. The shape of their shared life, frozen when the water took it. The most profound storytellers from that lost coast are the things people never made. They're the silent witnesses buried in the mud. Environmental time capsules. To find them, scientists take these long, cylindrical cores from the seabed. They pull up a vertical slice of history, a timeline written in soil and sediment. And within those layers, the story of the drowning is told with startling clarity. At the bottom of a core, you might find a thick, dark layer of peat. And within that peat, preserved for centuries, are the roots of trees. An entire fossilized forest floor captured in an instant. That was the solid, fertile ground the first settlers walked on. The foundation of their world. Then, directly above that rooted peat, the sediment changes. Abruptly, the dark organic matter ends, and it's replaced by a layer of coarse sand, mixed with the tiny, fragile shells of marine creatures. That sharp line, that sudden transition, is the moment, the precise instant the sea broke through. It's not a gradual blending, it's a geological event horizon. One season there was a forest or a pasture, the next it was under the North Sea. The violence of that change is frozen in the mud. We can read even finer details. Scientists analyze the pollen trapped in each layer. It acts like a botanical fingerprint. In the deepest peat, they find pollen from oak trees and hazel shrubs. These are plants of dry, stable land. They indicate a wooded, fertile landscape. Higher up, as conditions change, the pollen shifts. Oak and hazel fade away. In their place comes pollen from reeds and sedges, plants that thrive in wet, boggy conditions in freshwater marshes. This tells us the land was becoming waterlogged. Perhaps from the rising water table, even before the final breach, the ground was getting sick. Then, in that final sandy layer, all terrestrial pollen vanishes. It's replaced by microscopic remains of purely marine species. The story ends there. The transition is complete, from forest to marsh to open sea. The core sample holds the entire arc of the catastrophe. But the cores hold more than plants. They contain tiny fragments of animal bones, revealing the livestock these communities kept: tough, small cattle suited to the marshes and sheep grazing the salty grasses. Even the remains of insects are preserved, offering clues about the local climate, the living conditions. Each layer is a data point. Together, they create a precise, multi-layered timeline. This is how we know the landscape didn't just sink, it transformed. It went through stages of decline, a long, slow retreat that finally ended in a sudden, catastrophic surrender. These natural artifacts tell us not just what was lost, but how it was lost. They give a voice to the land itself, recounting its own slow submersion in a language of pollen, shells, and ancient roots. The sea didn't just come in slowly, it came with fury. That slow pressure of water needed a final trigger, and nature gave it. The Chronicles mark a turning point, a night that changed the map. January 16, 1362, a monstrous storm formed over the North Atlantic, an extratropical cyclone, immense. It drove straight into the shallow North Sea basin. And it arrived at the worst possible time, a spring tide. The moon's pull was already drawing the sea to its highest monthly peak, so the storm's ferocious winds pushing from the north now had a higher platform. They shoved a towering surge of water, a liquid wall, against a coastline that was already sinking, already saturated. The dikes, those earthen barriers that had held for generations, just vanished. They were overtopped, then breached, then erased. The water didn't flow. It roared. It filled the lowland basins behind the coast in hours. The land became part of the sea. The scale of loss was beyond comprehension. Medieval accounts struggle to frame it. They talk of parishes swallowed, countless villages gone. Modern historians, using tax records and population estimates, put the death toll along the coasts of England, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark at a staggering number. A demographic catastrophe. It reshaped entire regions, but the numbers, vast as they are, don't capture the human reality. This wasn't a statistic. It was a community's memory gone. A family's future ended. The collective knowledge of how to live on that fragile edge drowned in one night. The storm got a name that's lasted centuries. The Grote Mandrenke, the great drowning of men. The name itself is a monument. It marks the moment when the long, slow challenge of living with the sea became a definitive defeat. Vast farmland was permanently submerged. It created new bays and inlets that are still on our maps today. Settlements that had survived for centuries, adapting to the creeping water, became untenable. The salt poisoned the soil, the defenses were broken, the cost of rebuilding was impossible. That one night of apocalyptic weather showed a cruel truth about environmental change. The trend can be slow, almost invisible in a human lifetime, but the consequences often arrive suddenly, with overwhelming force. The gradual rise of the sea set the stage. The storm wrote the final act. The lost cities of the North Sea aren't just relics of a sinking coast. They're memorials to a night when the sky and the ocean conspired to rewrite the world. After the storm, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of stories. When a place disappears, when a neighbor's house is just gone by morning, people need a reason. Science was centuries away, so they used what they had: myth and memory. They made tales to make the senseless make sense. The folklore of the sunken coast is a literature of loss. Written not in ink but in whispers over generations, there's the legend of the drowned church bells. Fishermen on the Wadden Sea, on calm, misty days, would say they heard it. A deep tolling from under their boats, a haunting sound on still days or stormy nights. They said it was the bells of Rungholt's church, still ringing for a congregation that wasn't there anymore. That story isn't just a ghost tale, it's an auditory memory. the real bells, bronze probably, would have been some of the last things to sink. As the tower fell, air trapped in the bell chamber could have escaped. A deep groan as it hit the water. Survivors might have heard that final note and passed it down. Over time, the sound of a dying town became an eternal echo. The echo of a punished one. This is where folklore does its work. It assigns a cause, a catastrophe that felt random, that shattered any idea of a just world, needed a reason. The stories gave it one. In the tales, Rungholt became a city of arrogance. Its people mocked the church. They lived in luxury. They challenged the sea itself. In one story, drunken villagers made a priest give last rites to a pig, so their drowning wasn't a tragedy. It was divine retribution, a moral lesson written in water. That pattern repeats all along the drowned coasts, not just with cities but with land. Old tales talk about a vast, fertile plain that once stretched out to sea. A place called Vinter or Anders, a wealthy trading center. It sank because of its greed, its sins. The details change, but the core is the same. The sea became an agent of justice. That narrative had a purpose, a psychological one. It restored order. If disaster was a punishment, you could avoid it by living right, by respecting the church and the natural world. The story was a warning, a way to make a community careful in a dangerous place. But these legends were also a form of preservation. They were living memorials. Every time a parent told a child about the bells of Rungholt, it was an act of remembrance, making sure the place and the people lost weren't truly gone. They lived on in the story. The folklore embedded the trauma into the identity of the coastal people. To be from that coast was to know the land could be taken. That the past was right under the waves. That shared memory built a kind of resilience, a deep awareness of vulnerability. It shaped how those communities lived for centuries after. So the sunken cities lived a second life, not in stone and timber but in myth. They became archetypes, the proud city, the ghostly bells, the outlines seen in the waves on a clear day. These aren't just superstitions, they're the fingerprints of a historical experience. They show how people stitch their world back together after it comes apart. They turn a terrifying geological event into a narrative, something that can be carried, learned from, passed on. The lost land was gone from the map, but it found a permanent home in the imagination. That folklore about sunken bells and punished cities, that's a human reaction to an inhuman force, but the force itself was real. Its fingerprints are familiar. The climate was changing back then. The world was warming, and that warmth over generations lifted the sea. It made the storms stronger. It broke the coast. It's a pattern we know. The parallels aren't perfect, but they're profound. The medieval warm period was natural, solar activity, volcanic quiet. Our warming now is human-caused. It's far more rapid, but the physical consequences on a coastline, the rising water, the more intense weather, they follow the same logic. The ocean expanded, ice melted, the atmosphere held more energy. The result was a frontier that couldn't be defended. The difference is capacity, understanding. Medieval societies watched their world change without knowing why. They saw divine wrath, a test of faith, no climate models, no satellite data. Their response came from immediate, desperate necessity. They built dikes higher when the last one failed. They organized water boards because if your neighbor's section crumbled, your farm drowned. Their adaptation was local. Physical, reactive, an immense achievement of communal effort, but it was overwhelmed by a planetary-scale process they couldn't measure, couldn't name. For us, the understanding is clear. The science is unequivocal. We can map sea level rise down to the centimeter for any coastline. We can model storm surges with precision. We know the cause, and that knowledge brings a responsibility they never had. Their story shows the end point of a slow-motion crisis. It shows the fragility of even the most determined human engineering against a rising sea. The drowned streets of Rungholt are a data point in a centuries-long experiment. They prove that a sustained shift in the climate will, eventually, redraw the map. No amount of local heroism holds back a global tide, but their story isn't just fragility. It's also a masterclass in resilience. It shows how societies reorganize under existential pressure. The cooperative water boards, the shared maintenance of defenses, the painful decisions to abandon some lands to save others, these were social innovations forged in crisis. They highlight that the ultimate resource isn't just technology, it's social cohesion, the ability to work together for common survival. That lesson transcends centuries. Studying these lost cities becomes more than archaeology. It's a form of time travel, a chance to observe a full cycle, environmental change and human response from settlement to final abandonment. It provides a long-term context our own short political cycles often lack. We see the consequence of building on sinking ground, literally, metaphorically. Their fate urges us to look at our own vulnerable coastlines, our densely populated deltas, to ask the hard questions about adaptation, retreat, investment. Their experience whispers a truth across the centuries. Climate change isn't a future abstraction. It's a historical reality with a tangible human cost. The sunken cities of the North Sea are a memorial written in silt and legend. They remind us that the relationship between humanity and the planet is a constant negotiation. And the terms of that negotiation are always set, in the end, by the sea. A map is a guide, but it's also a snapshot, a statement of what a society knows. When the coastline is moving, that snapshot becomes a record of loss. Medieval and early modern cartographers had an impossible job. They were drawing a border that wouldn't stay put. Their maps, like the Carta Marina from 1539, they're layered with ghosts. You can see them, islands, inlets, towns on the shore, drawn with careful detail. And next to them, sometimes in tiny script, is one word, drowned. It's a quiet note, a cartographer telling the navigator that what's shown is already gone. These maps were practical, vital for trade, for safety. A ship's captain needed to know the hazards, even if the hazard was a sunken steeple. But in trying to be accurate, these mapmakers became accidental historians. They preserved the memory of a world that had vanished within living memory. Later Dutch maps tell a similar story, but from the other side. Polder maps for land reclamation, they often show the old coastline as a faint, dashed line. Inside that line is the new land, hard won. Outside is the sea, and in that blue sometimes are the outlines of the old parishes, the lost villages. Drawn as being under the water, this wasn't nostalgia. It was a legal necessity. To claim new land, you had to prove what was there before, and in doing that, they created a before and after diagram. A record of environmental change. If you place these maps in sequence, a century after another, you can watch it unfold. A bustling port on one map becomes a cluster of symbols marked submerged on the next. A wide peninsula on an early chart is just a scattering of tiny islands 50 years later, and then gone entirely. The coastline doesn't just move inland. It dissolves. These cartographic ghosts are powerful evidence. They prove the lost cities weren't vague legends. They were real, charted places. Their disappearance was a current event for the mapmakers. The struggle to keep the maps updated mirrors the physical struggle on the ground. It was a race they were destined to lose. Every new edition was a confession. That the old one was already obsolete, that the sea had taken another piece of the known world. So we hold these maps now not just as navigation tools, but as chronicles. They are the last official records of places like Rungholt before they slipped from geography into memory. They give us a fixed point, a date, a contour. They tell us that on this day, when this map was drawn, the cartographer still believed this town belonged to the land, and in that belief, however briefly, they saved it from being forgotten. A field underwater doesn't pay tax. That fact, it's simple, brutal, it sent a shock through the whole medieval legal system. When the sea took a manor, it wasn't just farmland gone. It was the foundation of the whole economy erased. The social contract was written on that land. A lord's power came from its rents, from its crops. A serf's obligations were tied to working that soil. So when the soil was gone, what then? The legal chaos that followed shows a society trying to adapt its rules to a new, watery reality. In Frisia, the response was this radical codification of community. They set up the Dikes, the Dyke law. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a binding legal framework. It made every landowner responsible for the section of dike in front of their property. From the wealthiest lord down to the smallest free farmer, your survival depended on your neighbor's maintenance. Theirs depended on yours. If you neglected your section, you could be fined. If your negligence caused a breach, you could be held liable for all the damage that came after. That created a powerful, localized democracy of survival. Disputes went to dike courts where everyone had a stake in the verdict. The law recognized a basic truth: against the sea, there were no private victories. Safety was collective or it was nothing. Over in England, the crown took a more centralized path. Royal officials would hold inquests into flooded manors. Their question was coldly practical. Could this land still produce revenue? If the answer was no, the king might formally reduce the tax burden or cancel it. A process called waste. These inquests were meticulous. They collected testimony from local jurors on exactly what was lost. So many acres of arable land, so many pastures, so many tenant houses. The records are heartbreaking in their bureaucratic detail. They show the crown trying to balance mercy with its own desperate need for income. Sometimes the loss was so total it just erased a lordship from the rolls. The former holder was left with a title to nothing but open water. This redistribution of loss had profound political consequences. A local lord whose wealth was washed away saw his power evaporate with it. He couldn't afford knights anymore. He couldn't maintain a household. His influence in regional affairs just crumbled. In many cases, that vacuum was filled by stronger, centralized monarchies, or by larger, more resilient neighboring lords. The disaster accelerated a shift power, moving from a scattered, land-based aristocracy toward more consolidated forms of authority. But it also sparked fierce, petty conflicts. When a river changed course after a flood, or a new inlet formed, who did the new fishing rights belong to? If one village's failed dike sent water into another's fields, who owed compensation? These disputes could ignite feuds that lasted generations. Communities turned on each other, scrambling for what was left of stable ground. The sea, in its indifference, became a powerful political actor. It redrew boundaries, it broke old alliances, it forced the creation of new legal concepts around shared liability, around environmental stewardship. What came out of this centuries-long crisis was more than stronger dikes. It was a new way of thinking about governance. The institutions born from this struggle, the water boards, the dike courts, the royal commissions on flooding, they were pragmatic innovations. They were built on an understanding some threats transcend individual ownership, that managing a shared environment requires shared rules. The lost cities did more than vanish. They forced a legal revolution, one that acknowledged for the first time in law that the ground beneath our feet is not always permanent, and that our survival might depend on the strength of our neighbor's wall. The land was taken, but it was also transformed. The flood waters that came in, they drowned the streets and the fields, but they did something deeper. They rewrote the biology of the place. When the salt sea rushed into those low basins, it covered the freshwater marshes and it poisoned them. That delicate balance, the peat bog built over thousands of years, was shattered in a season. Salt is a brutal agent. The freshwater reeds, the sedges, the willows, their roots couldn't handle the sudden brine. They died off. That whole plant community, the base of the food web, it collapsed. In place of the silent bog, a new ecosystem began to form. First came the salt-tolerant plants, tough cordgrass, sea lavender, samphire. These were plants that could handle the tide, being submerged twice a day. And they started trapping sediment with their roots, building up the muddy ground. A salt marsh was born. This was a landscape in transition, a brackish border between the drowned land and the open sea. It had its own life. Wading birds came to probe the mud. The air hummed with different insects. As more sediment piled up, as the land stabilized or the seabed rose, these marshes could change further. In some areas, they became vast tidal flats, expanses of sand and silt exposed at low tide, full of buried clams and worms and shrimp. This was a bonanza for new predators. Flocks of migratory birds used these flats as a vital feeding stop, and for the human communities left on the higher ground, the menu changed completely. The freshwater pike and perch from the streams were gone, their habitats buried under salt. Instead, the North Sea offered its bounty: cod, herring, plaice. Fishing shifted from riverbanks to boats, from weirs to nets in open water. The protein source, the taste of daily life, became marine. The most lasting record of this change is in the soil itself. In those vertical cores you see the story. At the bottom, a layer of dark, fibrous peat, the preserved remains of the freshwater world. It's rich, full of organic matter. Then, right above it, a sharp line, and on top of that line, a thick deposit of grayish-blue clay studded with microscopic shells, marine clay. It's dense, nutrient-poor, hard to farm. That clay layer is the final seal. It represents centuries of tidal deposition, settling over the drowned pastures, locking them away. The fertile soil was capped, like by a stone lid, under this sterile sediment. This succession, from freshwater bog to salt marsh to tidal flat, was a complete environmental overhaul. It happened on a scale no king could decree. The rising water didn't just erase the map of settlements. It erased the ancient map of life that was there before. It replaced a whispering, reed-filled world with the roar of the tides and the cry of gulls. The land didn't just sink. It changed its nature, becoming something alien to the people who had known it. This was a reminder that environmental change is holistic. It doesn't just move a shoreline, it redesigns the entire living system. The new, marine-dominated world was just as vibrant, just as complex, but it was a world for which the drowned cities had no blueprint. They left with what they could carry. Their homes were already gone. The water didn't just erase towns, it scattered the people. They went all across Europe. This wasn't a planned exodus, it was a desperate retreat, a slow tide of people moving inland away from the sea. They settled where they could, on higher ground with relatives on the edges of existing towns. And they often brought their old home with them in a name. You can see it on maps, villages called Neoland, meaning new land, or places with suffixes like Zale for a sluice gate. These names are echoes. They mark settlements founded by people from the drowned coasts, a way of planting a memory of the lost world into new soil, but they brought more than names. They carried a hard-won expertise. For generations, their entire way of life was about holding back the water. They were masters of the Dike, the seawall. They understood drainage, the precise slope of a canal, the engineering of a windmill pump. They knew maritime law, the Dijkrecht, which governed shared responsibility. When these displaced families arrived in new regions upriver in the Rhine Delta, into eastern England along the Baltic coast, they brought this technical knowledge. It was a form of intellectual capital born from crisis. Local lords facing their own water problems often sought out these refugees for their skills. A community with a flooded river valley would welcome a family who knew how to organize a dike-building collective. the newcomers didn't just build walls. They built institutions. They helped establish local water boards, teaching the principles of communal maintenance, levied contributions for defense. Their presence disseminated a culture of water management across Northern Europe, standardizing approaches to a universal problem. Their influence flowed through trade networks, too. A merchant from a drowned port might resettle in Hamburg or Bremen, bringing not only his goods but his connections, his understanding of North Sea commerce. The patterns of trade subtly rerouted around these new nodes of knowledge. The cultural landscape was altered, infused with the pragmatic, cooperative spirit forged on the sinking coasts. Foods, dialects, architectural styles for building on wet ground, all of it traveled inland with the displaced. This shows a counterintuitive truth. The drowning of the coast was an engine of cultural diffusion. Amid profound loss, it forced a dispersal of innovation. The technical and social solutions developed in one vulnerable place became gifts to a wider continent. The story of the lost cities isn't one of an ending. It's a story of transformation. The communities didn't simply cease to exist. They metamorphosed. Their legacy lives on in the fortified riverbanks of inland towns, in the governance of distant polders, in the very mindset of a Europe learning to negotiate with its waters. It shows that even the most devastating environmental change can have a strange, generative power, scattering seeds of knowledge that take root far from their original home. Those floodwaters from the Middle Ages, they never really went away. They were just held back, contained behind walls of earth and stone, and that whole struggle, it left its mark on the landscape. You can see it now. In the Netherlands, huge areas, almost a third of the country, sit below sea level. Over in eastern England, it's the same. Great stretches of Lincolnshire, Norfolk, they're just as low. These are the lands that made it, but that survival, it's not automatic. It's a permanent state, maintained by a whole system of defenses, and those systems are the direct descendants of the old medieval dikes and windmills. The battle was never really won, it was just paused, generation after generation. That pause was maintained by constant watchfulness, by engineering. And now that pause is under more threat than it's ever been. The global climate is changing. The sea is rising faster because of what people have done. This isn't the slow, natural creep from the medieval times. This is a rapid climb. It's measurable. The water is coming back with more force, and it's coming back to a coastline that's now packed with millions more people, with critical infrastructure, with whole economies. The warning from the past, the one written in the silt of Rungholt, it's more relevant now than ever. We've had previews of this new threat. In January of 1953, a devastating storm surge hit at high tide. It overwhelmed the sea defenses in the Netherlands, in England, in Belgium. It was a catastrophe on a medieval scale, but in the modern era, communities flooded. Thousands of lives lost. The vulnerability of these lowlands was laid completely bare. That event was a wake-up call. It led directly to two of the most ambitious engineering projects of the 20th century. In the Netherlands, the Delta Works, a staggering system, dams, sluices, locks, storm surge barriers. It actually redefined the coastline, shortened it by hundreds of miles just to make it defensible. Its centerpiece is the Meeslankering, these two massive, floating gates that can close off the Rotterdam waterway when a storm comes. It's a computer-controlled modern marvel, but its purpose is ancient. To hold back the sea, across the water guarding London, there's the Thames Barrier, a series of shining steel sectors that rotate up from the riverbed to form a wall against surge tides. Since it was finished in the 1980s, it's been closed hundreds of times. Each closure is a silent testament, a reminder of the persistent danger. These structures, they aren't monuments to some final victory. They're tools for an endless campaign. The lost cities of the North Sea, they're the deep memory of this place. They're the proof of what happens when defenses fail. They're silent streets preserved in the mud. They're not just archaeological sites, they're benchmarks. They show the high watermark of a past climate. And they whisper an urgent question about our future. The medieval engineers, they built with sod and timber. They reacted to each new breach. We build with steel and concrete. We use satellite data and climate models, but the fundamental equation, it hasn't changed. We're still building on that same sinking, fragile ground. The stakes, though, are immeasurably higher now. The story that started with the drowning of a single trading port, it now encompasses the fate of global capitals. Of food-producing regions, of cultural heritage, the struggle never ended, it just changed scale. These streets under the water, they're like a library. But the pages are made of mud and wood. Every piece of it, every posthole left in the seabed, it's a single page, and if you disturb it, that page is gone. This record under the sea, it's the most fragile one we have, and it's facing a lot of threats now. Bottom trawlers, their heavy nets, they scrape across the floor like plows. They churn up sediment that's been there for centuries. They can shatter things in an instant. Dredging for shipping lanes or for sand, it can erase a whole site. Just like that, even building for green energy, the big foundations for offshore wind turbines, they can disrupt layers, archaeological layers that haven't been touched for hundreds of years. And then there's the natural erosion, always, currents and storms slowly wearing the ruins away. So the cities that survived the drowning, they're facing a second disappearance. A slower one, and that puts us at a kind of crossroads, a tension between preservation and progress, because there's a real need for development, for clean energy, for sea routes. But there's also a duty to protect this past for the future. These sites, they aren't just for one nation, they're a chapter for everyone. So the international community, they made the UNESCO 2001 Convention. For protecting underwater cultural heritage, it sets up principles like preserving a site in place if you can, and putting its scientific value above commercial value. It's a statement saying the seabed isn't a lawless place, but the open sea is hard to police. Jurisdiction is complicated, monitoring costs money, the economic pressures are huge. A fishing boat, a barge, they might damage a site before anyone knows it's there. The convention gives us the map, but following it takes vigilance, it takes cooperation and funding. From nations, from industries, it asks a hard question. How do we balance what we need now with what we owe the past? These lost cities, they aren't just curiosities. They're archives, vulnerable ones. They hold data about climate, about trade, about how people lived, and we're just starting to learn how to read it. Their greatest value might still be buried, waiting in the silt, so the call now is for stewardship, active stewardship. That means doing surveys before any development on the seafloor. It means using technology, sonar, magnetometers, to monitor these sites over time. It means seeing the North Sea floor not as an empty space for resources, but as a museum. A submerged museum that needs managing. The stories of Rungholt and the other sunken places, they were almost lost to the waves once. Our challenge is to not lose them a second time. To silence or to the machinery of the modern world. Protecting them is how we honor the resilience they stand for, and it's how we keep the lessons they hold. For our own future on a coast that's always changing, the seabed has been whispering for a long time, and now those whispers are getting a voice. It's happening through digital reconstruction. Taking raw data and turning it into a living world, they use the precise measurements from sonar scans, the environmental clues from core samples, scattered details from old tax rolls, chronicles. It's a new kind of archaeology, a collaboration, scientists and digital artists working together. They take those points of data, the outline of a dike, the location of a posthole, the type of pollen in a layer of mud, and they start to build, pixel by pixel, polygon by polygon, the goal isn't to create a fantasy. It's a visualization, a scientifically informed best guess of what was there. Imagine a three-dimensional model of Rungholt's harbor materializing on a screen. You see the gentle curve of the dwelling mounds around the sheltered basin. You watch as simple wooden cogs, based on real wrecks found nearby, get rendered at a digital dock. Figures move along pathways, smoke rises from hearths. The model is silent, but it's full of implied life. It transforms a list of archaeological features into a place. A place you can almost believe you could visit. This technology goes further with virtual reality. The engagement isn't just visual, it's spatial. With a VR headset, you have this profound, unsettling experience. Standing in the middle of a village that hasn't existed for over 600 years, you can look up at the thatched roofs of longhouses, see the texture of the woven wattle walls. Watch the way light filters through the smoke hole. You can turn and see the landscape stretching to the horizon, not as open sea, but as the flat, green expanse of the marsh it once was. This is more than a video game, it's a form of digital time travel. It makes the loss tangible, in a way a textbook paragraph can't, even a photograph of an artifact can't. You're not just learning that a community was here, you are, for a fleeting moment, occupying its space. That creates a powerful, immediate emotional connection to the past. The abstract concept of a drowned city becomes a visceral reality. These digital recreations are tools for public understanding. They translate complex archaeological reports, dense historical data, into a language everyone can intuitively grasp. A 3D model of a harbor's layout shows the logic of medieval trade more clearly than a page of text. A VR walkthrough of a village demonstrates the social organization of a Terp community, how homes were arranged for mutual support and defense. They make the science accessible. They allow a school child, a history enthusiast, a policymaker to truly see what was at stake, and in doing that, they perform a quiet act of reclamation. For centuries, these places existed only in legend, in scattered fragments under the waves. Now we can give them a visual form again. We can pull them back momentarily from the realm of myth into the realm of the visible. This digital resurrection doesn't erase the tragedy of their loss. If anything, it deepens our understanding of its scale, but it also completes a circle. It takes the whispers recovered by Sonar, the clues pulled from the mud, and it gives them a home, a digital monument, built not of stone but of light and data, ensuring the lost cities are remembered not just as names on a map, but as places where people once lived, worked, and looked out at a very different horizon. Separating these threads, it misses the story. The Chronicles give dates names, but they're filtered through what the scribe believed. The sediment core gives a timeline of environmental change, but it's silent on the human experience. The legend of the ghostly bells, that's a cultural memory, but it obscures the physical cause. None of these sources alone can tell you what happened. The breakthrough is when you braid them, when a historian's date for a great flood is matched layer for layer with the coarse sand and marine shells in a geologist's core sample. That's the moment the legend becomes data. The story moves from myth into documented physical reality. That's interdisciplinary synthesis. It's the only way to listen to a past that speaks in many different fragmented languages. Take Rungholt. A folklorist has the tale of the arrogant city punished by the sea. An archaeologist using sonar maps the orderly harbor basin and the dwelling mounds on the seafloor. A climatologist models the storm tracks and surge heights possible for the North Sea in the 14th century. A historian finds a tax record from a nearby town, noting the sudden end of payments from Rungholt's merchants after 1362. Individually, each piece is a curiosity. Together, they form a corroborated narrative. The folklore preserves the trauma. The archaeology confirms the settlement's size and its sudden end. The climate science explains the mechanics of the storm. The historical record pins it to a specific year. The synthesis doesn't just confirm the event happened. It reconstructs its texture, its cause, and its lasting echo in the human imagination. This approach transforms how you see history itself. It shows that the rise and fall of a medieval port wasn't merely a political or economic event. It was an environmental one. The decisions of its people, where to build, how to farm, when to reinforce a dike, were constant negotiations with a changing landscape. The medieval warm period wasn't just a footnote about weather. It was an active character in the drama, lifting the sea, fueling the storms, setting the stage. By weaving climatology into the narrative, you see the environment is not a passive backdrop. It's a dynamic participant. These lost cities are a perfect case study. They force you to abandon the old, compartmentalized view. You can't understand their fate through military history or art history alone. You need the mud core. You need the wind model. You need the ghost story. This holistic view carries an implication for our present. It shows that humanity's story and the planet's story have never been separate. Our civilizations are built upon and are vulnerable to the same geological and climatic processes that have always shaped the Earth. The tale of the submerged coast is a lesson in interconnectedness. It argues that to face our own environmental challenges, we have to think in the same integrated way. We have to fuse economics with ecology, engineering with social science, policy with a deep understanding of the past. The silent streets under the North Sea are more than an archaeological site. They're a testament to the necessity of seeing the whole picture. A reminder that the most pressing truths are often found not in one field, but in the fertile ground where they all meet. That line between sky and sea, it wasn't a promise, it was a boundary, and it was under siege. For the people on that sinking coast, the water was a daily contradiction. It was their source, their food, their trade, their identity as fishermen, and it was the force that could erase everything by morning. This duality, this intimate relationship with a capricious neighbor, it carved a deep groove into their mind. Their entire culture became an expression of living with that tension. You hear it in their prayers, medieval manuscripts from coastal monasteries. They show two different kinds of supplication, right next to each other. Blessings for ships, for a good catch, for prosperous voyages, and then, on the same page, desperate litanies, pleading for protection from the tempest. For the safety of the dikes, for the land to hold, their faith had to hold both, the bounty and the terror of the same element. The sea wasn't just a physical presence. It was a spiritual actor capable of providence and wrath. This shaped a worldview where the natural and the divine were linked. A bad storm wasn't just weather. It could feel like a judgment, a test of the community's virtue. This constant, low-grade threat, it fostered a unique social fabric. Survival wasn't an individual endeavor. The integrity of the dike in front of your neighbor's farm was as vital to your safety as the one before your own door. This necessity bred a culture of communal responsibility. It was codified in law, the Decret, but it ran deeper than statute. It became a shared ethic, a mutual understanding. Your vigilance protected my family, and mine protected yours. Barn raisings were common across Europe, but dike raisings were existential. They were acts of collective self-preservation, reinforcing the literal ground beneath their society. Yet, alongside that stubborn cooperation, there was likely a thread of fatalism. Imagine raising your children on land you knew was sinking, telling them stories of towns that vanished in the night. Watching over a lifetime as the high tide line crept closer to the village well each year, this could instill a profound vulnerability, a quiet acknowledgement. That for all their effort, their control was provisional. Their world was borrowed, leased from the sea on terms they could not fully dictate. This wasn't a paralysis of fear. It was a sober realism woven into their outlook. It made them meticulous planners, expert engineers, deeply attached to the community that was their only bulwark. This mindset echoes in their art and stories, not in grand paintings but in the local, the folkloric, the tales of sunken bells and punished cities. They aren't just entertainment, they're psychological artifacts. They're how a people process the unthinkable, transforming random tragedy into a narrative with a moral. A story about Rungholt's pride gave the disaster a reason. It made the terrifying seem, in some way, avoidable. If you lived humbly, maintained the dikes, respected the church, perhaps your town would be spared. The legend was a coping mechanism, a way to impose order on chaos. To understand the lost cities, then you have to see beyond the drowned timbers. You have to try to inhabit the mental landscape of those who lived there, a landscape marked by a deep, pragmatic love for a dangerous home, by a resilience forged in shared vulnerability, and by the quiet anxiety of watching the edge of your world, that line where you met the horizon, slowly dissolving into the advancing tide. Their greatest monument isn't just what they built. It's the steadfast, watchful spirit they cultivated while living on the brink. That line in the sand was always temporary. The medieval story of the North Sea coast is a case study, a centuries-long experiment in living with environmental change. And from that experiment, we can pull lessons for our own coastal futures. The first lesson is about governance. The water boards in the Netherlands, the Dyke courts in Frisia, these weren't commands from a distant king. They were hyper-local, democratic institutions. Born from absolute necessity, every landowner had a voice because every landowner had skin in the game. Your survival depended on the integrity of your neighbor's wall. This model of community-based management proved durable. It shows that resilience isn't just about concrete and steel. It's about social cohesion, building systems where responsibility is shared, where it's transparent and directly tied to collective survival. In an age of centralized bureaucracy, that medieval insight feels modern. The most effective defense may be a community that watches its own walls. The second lesson is a warning about compound events. The medieval drownings weren't caused by a slow creep of water alone. They were the result of a deadly synergy. The gradual rise of the sea set the stage. It lowered the land, it saturated the defenses. Then the storm arrived. The great drowning of men in 1362 was that compound event. The gradual trend met the extreme weather, and the result was catastrophic. Our climate models now tell us this is the scenario we face globally. Sea level rise provides the higher platform. More energetic storms provide the shove. The medieval coast demonstrates what happens when those two forces converge. It's a lesson in risk multiplication. We must plan not for the gradual change or the rare storm, but for the moment they collide. This leads to the third lesson, perhaps the most human one. The uneven burden of loss. When the water came, it didn't drown abstractions. It drowned homes, farms, and futures. The displacement that followed reshuffled societies, creating tensions between newcomers and established residents. The economic shock hit the poorest hardest, those with the least resources to rebuild or relocate. The medieval record is a chronicle of social dislocation. It reminds us that environmental crises are never neutral. They amplify existing inequalities. The question of who gets to live on safe ground and who is left exposed on the vulnerable margins is as pressing today as it was 700 years ago. Planning for resilience must also mean planning for justice, for managed retreat, for supporting those most at risk. Above all, the drowned cities deliver one truth. Coastlines are not permanent. They are dynamic, contested frontiers. Societies that build on sinking ground, on eroding bluffs, on subsiding deltas, do so at their own peril. The investment might last a generation or 10, but the geologic and climatic forces operate on a longer clock. The medieval communities, for all their ingenuity, were building on a foundation that was being withdrawn. Their story is a caution against short-term thinking. It argues for humility in the face of natural processes we can measure but cannot fully command. So as we look at our own maps, at megacities built on river deltas, at sprawling suburbs on barrier islands, the ghostly outlines of Rungholt and its sister cities are not just relics. They are beacons. They illuminate two paths. One path is the medieval example of community solidarity and adaptive governance, a model of resilience we would do well to emulate. The other path is their fate, a warning of what happens when we ignore the slow creep of change until the storm finally arrives. Their silence from the seabed is a question. How will we write the next chapter for our own vulnerable shores? The dialogue between people and their planet is written in landscapes we can't see anymore. The lost cities of the North Sea, they're not just forgotten points on a map, they're monuments to that conversation, a profound conversation about where we build, how we adapt, what we leave behind when the water comes in. This story moves from the slow, creeping lift of medieval seas to the legendary fury of the Grote Mandrenke. It weaves climate and culture and catastrophe together into a single tapestry, a sobering one. It reminds us that history isn't always in dry tombs or dusty archives. Sometimes it's waiting just beneath the waves in the quiet dark of the seabed, holding silent lessons about adaptation, about hubris, about the stubborn resilience of communities facing the unimaginable. These sunken streets speak a language of sediment and memory. They tell us environmental change isn't a new story, it's an ancient rhythm, a rhythm human societies have always had to dance to. The difference for us is awareness. We have the tools now to listen to the past, to read its warnings in the core samples. In the Sonar maps, we can understand the compound logic, the logic of a slow trend meeting a sudden storm. That knowledge, that's our responsibility. As we finish this look at a world reclaimed by the sea, remember the same waters, the waters that hide these secrets. They're the ones lapping against our own shores today. They continue to shape our world, testing our defenses, testing our wisdom. The dialogue isn't over. We're just the latest voices in it. If this journey into a sunken past was compelling, there are other chapters, countless hidden chapters waiting. Please subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries history has left behind, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. What do these watery ghosts from the medieval coast make you think about? About our own future? Share your reflections in the comments.